This week on the Retirement Quick Tips podcast, I'm talking about some of the key provisions of the recently passed and signed into law One Big Beautiful Bill Act and how that might impact you. Now, today I'm talking about how the One Big Beautiful Bill is changing planning considerations and charitable giving considerations for those of you who like to donate to charity. Now, there are a couple of key changes. One of them is good, and one of them kind of puts some handcuffs, especially if you have a higher income or you itemize, which generally 90% of Americans, I believe is the accurate statistic. 9 out of 10 of you are just going to take the standard deductions, in which case you are going to benefit from the changes going into effect as it relates to charitable giving. But for those of you who itemize, the takeaway here is that you want to pay close attention to these changes. And if you want to make a large contribution, especially if you have it itemized, especially if you have a higher income, you want to consider making those contributions this year. Because if you look at a lot of different analysis and scenarios, case studies, these changes that are going to go into effect are going to limit what you can deduct for people who itemize. And so the rules are more relaxed today than they will be next year. So that's one of the key planning considerations here is that if you are itemizing and you want to make a charitable donation and a substantial one at that, you want to navigate these rule changes carefully because you may not get the same type of benefit that you get today. And possibly moving forward, your contributions or utilizing other strategies like charitable bunching. That's where you basically put a bunch of charitable contributions together and do more, like 2-3 times more in a single year than you would typically do. And that way you can still benefit from the tax deduction. So back up for a second and talk about the benefit for those of you who are just going to take the standard deduction. Again, this applies to most people. One of the things about the original Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I don't know if it was intended or unintended, but one of the consequences of that was that for most people, it completely changed because it raised the standard deduction so much. Basically, everybody, like 90% of people, just claimed the standard deduction. It was much simpler than itemizing their deductions, and they got a bigger tax break for doing that because the itemized or the standard deduction was raised significantly. I think it was doubled, if I recall correctly. But the new rules basically allow you to, even if you take the standard deduction starting next year, on top of that, you can also deduct charitable contributions. Again, even if you're taking the standard deduction. Now, this is great because I was reading an article about this the other day as I was planning for this. And what this provision will do by allowing people to deduct charitable contributions on top of the standard deduction is it's estimated to generate $74 billion for nonprofits over the next decade, because people who are going to give money are generally a lot of times going to give money regardless. You want to support your church or your favorite charities. You know, the tax benefit that you get, the deduction that you get from making those charitable contributions is meaningful and helpful, and it helps incentivize people to give more. But when you don't have that tax incentive like has been in place for the last several years to give, again, unless you itemize, for the last several years, you haven't been able to recognize a tax deduction, basically get a write-off for donations. But starting next year in 2026, you can take a deduction up to a limit and still use the standard deduction. So the contribution limit to charity is $1,000 for an individual and $2,000 if you're married. Now, again, if you want to do more than that, you can get a bigger benefit, but you're going to want to itemize in order to get that additional tax break. And even then, they're putting some restrictions in place. So starting in 2026, the deduction for charitable contributions does not start until you have donated at least 0.5% of your adjusted gross income. So for example, let's say you make $200,000 a year. Half of a percent is $1,000. Again, this is for people who itemize. You're not going to start getting a tax benefit on any contributions until those contributions exceed that $1,000, or in this case, it's half of a percent of $2,000, 200,000, excuse me. So whatever half of a percent of your adjusted gross income, anything you do below that threshold, you're not going to get a tax benefit for. So you have to do more giving. You have to do, 1%, 2%, 3%. So a strategy here would be to not give every year, but maybe to get your charitable contributions up to several percent where you can really benefit from that. The tax deduction, you would bunch. I mentioned that already. Bunching, where you basically load up a bunch of charitable contributions into 1 year, and maybe you do that every 3 to 5 years so that you can itemize, you can get a bigger tax deduction, and it'll help you out, especially if your income varies quite a bit. These are all strategies that you need to talk to your tax advisor about, and you need to understand the implications. I don't like that it makes things a bit more complicated. It puts some limits on what you can deduct. There are some additional limits here too. What I've described here is not all inclusive of everything in every situation. It is a bit more complicated than that. But generally, if you don't itemize, you're going to get a nice little tax deduction for making charitable contributions starting next year, which is a big benefit. If you do itemize, it's a bit more complicated than that. And if you want to give, especially substantial amounts, and you want a nice tax deduction for it, you got to dig into the weeds and look into it a little bit more. So that's the main planning consideration there, is you want to carefully look at bunching, some other strategies that can help you maximize a write-off in a particular year. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Ashley Michike, and this is the Retirement Quick Tips Podcast.